Colorado Territory, 1870. Xavier Jameson squinted against the harsh midday sun as he surveyed the rolling plains stretching before him. At 25, he had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. The open range of the Thompson Valley had been his home for 3 years now, ever since he had left behind the bloodshed of the war between the states and headed west with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the ghosts that haunted him. "Last one for today," he muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the rope as he guided his chestnut mare toward the stray calf that had wandered from the herd. The spring roundup was nearly complete, and tomorrow the cattle would begin the long drive north to the railhead in Cheyenne. Xavier's lean frame moved with practiced ease as he swung down from his saddle. At his full height of 6 feet, with broad shoulders and strong hands hardened by ranch work, he cut an impressive figure. The ladies in town at the occasional dance would cast admiring glances at his clean-shaven face, strong jaw, and piercing blue eyes. But Xavier kept his distance, tipping his hat politely before finding a reason to step outside or volunteer for the next watch. The frontier is no place for tenderness, he'd remind himself. Out here, attachment is just another word for vulnerability. The war had taught him that lesson well. He had watched friends die in his arms, seen families torn apart, promises broken. The West was just another battlefield, only the enemies were different: drought, blizzards, rustlers, and the ever-present threat of starvation. A man survived by keeping his guard up and his connections few. As he secured the calf and prepared to return it to the herd, distant thunder rolled across the plains. Xavier glanced up, surprised. The sky to the west had darkened ominously, though it had been clear blue only an hour before. "Storm's coming in fast," he said to his horse. "Best get back to the ranch." By the time he delivered the calf to the herd and turned toward home, fat raindrops were already pelting the dry earth. The sudden spring storm intensified with alarming speed. Lightning cracked overhead, causing his mare to sidestep nervously. Xavier leaned forward, patting her neck. "Easy, girl, we'll find shelter." He knew these lands well enough to remember an abandoned line shack about a half-mile east. It wasn't much, but it would keep him dry until the storm passed. Turning his horse, he rode hard through the increasingly heavy downpour. The shack came into view just as hail began to mix with the rain. Xavier dismounted quickly and led his horse to the lean-to at the side of the small structure. After ensuring she was secure, he pushed open the weathered door, eager to escape the stinging ice pellets now falling from the sky. What he found inside stopped him cold. Huddled in the corner on a thin, tattered blanket was a young woman. Her dress, once perhaps a fine blue calico, was now little more than rags, torn and mud-stained. Her golden blonde hair hung in damp tangles around a face that, despite its current state of distress, possessed a delicate beauty that took Xavier's breath away. But it was her eyes that held him, large, amber-brown, and filled with a mixture of fear and defiance as she clutched a small knife in her trembling hand. "Stay back," she warned, her voice surprisingly steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "I mean no harm, but I will defend myself." Xavier raised his hand slowly. "No need for that, miss. I'm just seeking shelter from the storm, same as you, I reckon." The woman's gaze flicked to the window where rain lashed against the glass, then back to Xavier. She didn't lower the knife. "Name's Xavier Jameson. I work at the Golden Plains Ranch about 5 miles southwest of here." He kept his voice even, unthreatening. "I'm not looking for trouble." After a long moment, she lowered the knife slightly. "Delilah. Delilah Patterson." Xavier nodded, noticing how she shivered in her damp clothing. Without another word, he shrugged off his oilskin coat and offered it to her, keeping his distance. "You look like you could use this more than me." Delilah hesitated, suspicion warring with necessity in her expression. Finally, the cold won out. She reached for the coat with her free hand, the knife still gripped in the other. "Thank you," she said quietly, wrapping it around her shoulders. Xavier moved slowly to the opposite side of the single-room shack and busied himself with starting a small fire in the rusted stove. His mind raced with questions. What was a young woman doing alone in an abandoned line shack? Her speech was educated, her manners refined despite her circumstances. She was clearly not a local ranch girl or farmer's daughter. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Xavier settled on a 3-legged stool near the stove, deliberately giving Delilah her space. "Storm might last a while," he said, breaking the silence. Mind if I ask what brings you to this particular shelter, Miss Patterson? Delilah had finally tucked the knife into a pocket of her tattered dress, though Xavier noticed she kept her hand close to it. She couldn't be more than 20, he guessed, though the weariness in her eyes spoke of experiences beyond her years. I'm traveling to Denver, she said after a pause. Or I was, until the wagon train I joined was attacked by bandits 3 days ago. Her voice caught and she looked away. They took everything. I ran. I've been walking since, staying hidden. Xavier felt an unwelcome surge of compassion. He'd heard of the attack. Everyone in the territory was talking about it. 3 men killed, the rest scattered, wagons plundered. He hadn't heard that there might be survivors still out on the plains. You've been alone out here for 3 days? He asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. She lifted her chin slightly. I'm still alive, aren't I? Despite himself, Xavier smiled. There was steel beneath that fragile exterior. That you are, Miss Patterson, that you are. Outside, the storm intensified, thunder shaking the small shack to its foundation. Xavier knew he wouldn't be returning to the ranch tonight. As the evening wore on, an uneasy truce formed between them. Xavier shared the jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, and Delilah gradually revealed more of her story. She was 19 from St. Louis, traveling west to take a position as a schoolteacher in Denver. Her parents had died the previous year from influenza, leaving her alone in the world. The school board sent money for my passage, she explained, the firelight casting shadows across her face. Everything I owned was in that wagon. Xavier nodded, understanding the devastation of starting over with nothing. After the war, he'd returned home to Tennessee to find his family farm burned, his parents buried in the churchyard, and nothing left but bitter memories. The West has a way of stripping a person down to essentials, he said quietly. Sometimes that's not such a bad thing. Delilah studied him, her amber eyes reflecting the dancing flames. You sound like you know something about starting over, Mr. Jameson. Xavier, he corrected, surprised to find himself wanting to hear his given name from her lips. And yes, I suppose I do. That night, Xavier slept on the hard floor near the door, giving Delilah the only blanket and what remained of the privacy the small shack could offer. He told himself his vigilance was merely practical. Bandits might still be roaming the area, but he couldn't deny the unexpected protectiveness he felt toward this brave, determined young woman. As he drifted toward sleep, Xavier realized this was the first real conversation he'd had with anyone in months. Out on the range, words were functional things, used sparingly among men who communicated more through gestures and shared labor than speech. Something about Delilah's presence had loosened a knot inside him, one he hadn't even recognized was there. The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. Morning arrived with clearing skies and chirping birds. Xavier woke at first light, his body accustomed to the rhythm of ranch life. Delilah still slept, her golden hair spread across the folded blanket she used as a pillow, her face peaceful in repose. The rags she wore seemed even more pitiful in the clear morning light. Xavier slipped outside quietly. He tended to his horse, filled his canteen from the rain barrel, and contemplated his next move. The right thing, the only thing, would be to take Delilah to town. The sheriff could arrange proper assistance, perhaps find her passage to Denver with another wagon train or stagecoach. Yet the thought of simply depositing her in Greeley and riding away left him strangely hollow. When he returned inside, Delilah was awake, attempting to bring some order to her tangled hair with her fingers. She had folded his coat neatly on the stool. "Good morning," she said, a hint of color touching her cheeks as she realized he was watching her improvised grooming. "Morning," he replied, setting down the filled canteen. "Storm's past. I need to get back to the ranch, but I'll take you to town first. Sheriff Thompson's a good man, he'll help you get to Denver." Delilah's hands stilled in her hair. "That's very kind, but," she hesitated, "I have no money for passage." "Nothing to offer in payment." Xavier frowned. The stage line might. "The stage line requires payment," she interrupted, her voice firm, "and I won't accept charity." The determination in her eyes reminded Xavier of a young colt he'd once trained, proud and spirited, unwilling to be handled roughly but eager to prove its worth. An idea began to form in his mind, one that surprised him even as he considered it. "Golden Plains Ranch is short-handed," he said slowly. Mrs. Reynolds, the owner's wife, has been saying she needs help with the house and cooking since their daughter married last fall. It wouldn't be fancy work, but it would pay enough for your stage fare in a month or two. Delilah straightened, a spark of hope lighting her eyes. You think she would hire me like this? She gestured at her bedraggled appearance. Xavier allowed himself a small smile. Mrs. Reynolds has a soft heart for strays, and she's about your size. She could probably spare a dress or two until you get on your feet. I'm not a stray, Delilah objected, though her expression had softened. And I'm an excellent cook, my mother taught me. Then it's settled, Xavier said, wondering what had possessed him to make such an offer. Bringing a young, beautiful woman to the ranch would only complicate the simple existence he had carefully constructed. We should get moving if we want to reach Golden Plains by midday. The ride to the ranch took longer than usual. Xavier's mare carried double, with Delilah perched behind him, her hands hesitantly resting at his waist. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo the unsettled rhythm of his thoughts. He had spent 3 years building walls around himself, creating a life defined by work and solitude. Now, in the space of one stormy evening, those walls had developed their first crack. When they crested the final hill overlooking Golden Plains Ranch, Xavier felt Delilah's sharp intake of breath. The sprawling ranch house stood proudly amid cottonwood trees, with bunkhouses, barns, and corrals spreading out around it. Cattle dotted the verdant spring pastures, and smoke curled invitingly from the main house chimney. It's beautiful, Delilah murmured, her voice close to his ear. It's home, Xavier replied simply, spurring his horse forward down the slope. Thomas Reynolds, the ranch owner, was the first to spot them riding in. A burly man with a silver-streaked beard, he watched with undisguised curiosity as Xavier helped Delilah down from the horse. Jameson, he greeted, his eyes moving from Xavier to the bedraggled young woman. Didn't expect you back with company. Mr. Reynolds, Xavier nodded respectfully. This is Miss Delilah Patterson. She survived the wagon train attack 3 days back. I found her sheltering in the old line shack during the storm. Understanding dawned on Reynolds' weathered face. The attack by Farley's gang. My God, girl, you're lucky to be alive. Farley, Xavier asked sharply. Jim Farley was notorious throughout the territory, a former Confederate guerrilla who had brought his particular brand of violence west after the war. They're sure it was him. Reynolds nodded grimly. Army patrol found evidence. They're on his trail now. He turned back to Delilah. Miss Patterson, you're welcome at Golden Plains. Martha will be beside herself. She loves nothing more than someone to fuss over. As if summoned by her name, Martha Reynolds appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a plump, pleasant-faced woman whose kind heart was matched only by her no-nonsense efficiency in running the household. Xavier Jameson, is that a young lady I see? She called, already hurrying down the steps. Good heavens, child, what happened to you? Within minutes, Delilah was whisked away to the house, Martha's arm around her shoulders as she clucked sympathetically over the girl's state. Xavier watched them go, an odd sense of loss tugging at him despite knowing Delilah was in good hands. She tell you much about the attack? Reynolds asked quietly once the women were out of earshot. Xavier shook his head. Only that she ran and has been hiding since. She's heading to Denver, was supposed to be a schoolteacher there. Reynolds whistled low. Schoolteacher, huh? Well, she's made of stern stuff to survive on her own out there. He clapped Xavier on the shoulder. Good thing you found her, son, good thing indeed. Xavier nodded, but as he led his horse to the stable, he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps it was he who had been found. The next week passed in a blur of activity. The cattle drive to Cheyenne departed as scheduled, but Xavier, to his own surprise as much as everyone else's, volunteered to stay behind with the skeleton crew that would mine the ranch during the drive. He told himself it was because someone needed to watch for rustlers who might take advantage of the reduced manpower. He avoided examining his true motivations too closely. Delilah, meanwhile, settled quickly into ranch life. Martha Reynolds had indeed taken her under wing, providing not only clothing but a comfortable bedroom in the main house. By the third day, she was helping with meals and housework, her natural grace and intelligence winning over the remaining ranch hands. Xavier found himself inventing reasons to visit the main house. A broken hinge that needed fixing, a question about supplies, Each time he would catch glimpses of Delilah, now dressed in simple but clean calico dresses borrowed from Martha, her golden hair neatly braided or pinned up, her cheeks flushed with healthy color from good food and rest. On the 7th day after her arrival, Xavier entered the kitchen to find Delilah alone, kneading bread dough with strong, capable hands. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, turning her hair to spun gold. "Mr. Jameson," she greeted him with a smile. "Mrs. Reynolds is resting. Can I help you with something?" Xavier removed his hat, suddenly aware of the trail dust on his clothes. "Just checking if there's coffee." Delilah nodded toward the stove. "Fresh made, cups are in the cupboard." As Xavier poured himself coffee, a comfortable silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Delilah's hands working the dough. He found himself watching the graceful movement of her wrists, the concentration in her brow. "You've settled in well," he observed, leaning against the counter. Delilah smiled without looking up. "Everyone has been kind. Mrs. Reynolds says I have a gift for bread making." She hesitated before adding, "I've saved some money already. Not enough for the stage to Denver yet, but soon." Xavier felt an unexpected twinge at the mention of her departure. "No hurry," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "Ranch can use the help." Now she did look up, her amber eyes studying his face. "I'm grateful for what you did, Xavier, finding me, bringing me here. She swallowed. "I was beginning to lose hope out there." The vulnerability in her admission touched something deep within him. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said softly, "they wouldn't have." Their eyes held for a moment too long, and Xavier felt something shift between them, like the first tremor before an avalanche. He straightened abruptly, setting down his half-finished coffee. "I should get back to work. Fences on the north pasture need checking." He was halfway to the door when her voice stopped him. "I still have nightmares," she said quietly, "about the attack. About being alone out there, but then I remember you riding through that door and they fade." Xavier stood frozen, his back to her, his heart hammering in his chest. In that moment, he recognized the danger Delilah Patterson posed, not to his safety, but to the carefully constructed fortress around his heart. "You're safe now," he managed, and fled the kitchen before she could see the emotion on his face. Over the next 2 weeks, Xavier threw himself into ranch work with renewed vigor, exhausting himself with physical labor in hopes of quieting his mind. He still saw Delilah daily. Golden Plains wasn't large enough to avoid anyone completely, but he maintained a polite distance, limiting their interactions to brief exchanges and nods of greeting. Yet even as he physically withdrew, Xavier found his thoughts increasingly occupied by her. He noticed small things, how she had planted flowers beside the porch steps, the gentle way she spoke to the ranch dog, her laugh when she sat on the porch with Martha in the evenings. One morning, Xavier was repairing a wagon wheel when he heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. Looking up, he saw Sheriff Thompson's deputy, a young man named Ellis, standing on the porch with Delilah and Martha. The women's faces were pale with concern. Xavier set down his tools and strode toward the house, tension coiling in his gut. "What's happened?" he asked as he approached. The deputy tipped his hat. "Jameson was just telling the ladies we got word that Farley's gang hit another wagon train yesterday, about 40 miles east. Army's still on their trail, but they're heading this way." Xavier's eyes immediately went to Delilah. She had gone very still, her hands clutching the porch railing. "Any particular reason they'd come this direction?" Xavier asked, though he already suspected the answer. The deputy looked uncomfortable. "Well, there's talk that they're looking for a witness. Someone who got away from the first attack." His eyes flicked briefly to Delilah. "Sheriff's organizing extra patrols around the area ranches, but he wanted me to warn folks to stay alert." After the deputy departed, Martha fussed over Delilah, insisting she lie down and rest. Xavier waited until the older woman had gone inside before approaching Delilah, who remained on the porch, staring out at the distant hills. "Did they see you?" he asked without preamble. "During the attack? Would Farley or his men recognize you?" Delilah's knuckles whitened on the railing. "I don't know, it was chaos. People screaming, shots firing. I hid under a wagon at first, then ran when one of them started setting fire to the canvas covers." She turned to face Xavier, fear and determination mingling in her eyes. "I should leave. I'm putting everyone here in danger." "No," Xavier said firmly. The most dangerous thing you could do is be out there alone. Farley might be looking for a witness, but he has no way of knowing you're here specifically. But if they come, then we'll be ready. Xavier's voice hardened. I fought men like Farley in the war, men who prey on the weak and defenseless. I won't let him hurt you or anyone at Golden Plains. Delilah studied his face, something softening in her expression. You were a soldier. It wasn't a question, but Xavier nodded anyway. Confederate cavalry, not proud of the cause, but I did my duty. And after? After was difficult. Xavier rarely spoke of those dark days following Appomattox, when he'd returned to find nothing left and vengeance burning in his heart. I did things I'm not proud of. Coming west was a chance to start fresh. Delilah reached out hesitantly, her fingers just brushing his hand where it rested on the railing. The touch, though slight, sent warmth coursing through him. We all have pasts we're running from, she said softly. Mine caught up with me on that wagon train. Xavier turned his hand, allowing his fingers to intertwine with hers for the briefest moment. What do you mean? Delilah withdrew her hand, wrapping her arms around herself. Another time, perhaps, I should help Mrs. Reynolds with dinner. She retreated into the house, leaving Xavier with more questions than answers and the lingering warmth of her touch on his skin. That night Xavier couldn't sleep. He paced the small room in the bunkhouse that, as ranch foreman, afforded him privacy from the other hands. The news of Farley's proximity had awakened old instincts, the hypervigilance that had kept him alive during the war. But it was more than concern about Farley that kept him awake. It was Delilah's words, we all have pasts we're running from. Mine caught up with me on that wagon train. What had she meant? What past could a 19-year-old schoolteacher be running from? Just after midnight, a sound outside drew Xavier's attention. Pulling on his boots and grabbing his revolver, he moved silently to the window. In the moonlight, he could make out a figure crossing the yard toward the barn, a woman in a dark cloak. Delilah. Xavier cursed under his breath and hurried outside. He caught up to her just as she reached the barn door. Where do you think you're going? He demanded, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the ranch. Delilah startled, then squared her shoulders. I told you, I'm putting everyone in danger by staying. So you're just going to walk to Denver? Alone at night with Farley's gang somewhere between here and there? Xavier's voice rose despite his efforts to contain his anger. That's not brave, Delilah, it's foolish. I didn't ask for your opinion, Mr. Jameson, she retorted, her own temper flaring. I've survived on my own before. Barely, Xavier shot back, if I hadn't found you in that shack. I would have managed, she insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. I've been managing on my own since I was 16. Xavier frowned. You said your parents died last year. A flash of panic crossed Delilah's face before she composed herself. They did, but they were ill for a long time before. I had to take care of myself. She was lying, Xavier realized with a jolt, but before he could press further, the sound of approaching horses broke the night's stillness. Not the casual approach of returning ranch hands, but the deliberate, cautious pace of men trying to move quietly. Xavier reacted instantly, pulling Delilah into the shadows of the barn. Inside, he whispered urgently, stay hidden. For once, she didn't argue, slipping through the door while Xavier moved to the corner of the building to assess the threat. In the moonlight, he could make out 5 riders approaching slowly from the east, their horses picking their way carefully across the pasture rather than using the main road. No honest men rode that way in the middle of the night. Xavier eased back into the barn, finding Delilah crouched behind a stack of hay bales. Her eyes widened as he joined her. Riders, he explained tersely, 5 of them. Coming in quiet like. Farley, she whispered, fear evident in her voice, could be need to warn the house. Xavier checked his revolver, making sure all 6 chambers were loaded. Stay here. Keep low, keep quiet. He started to rise, but Delilah caught his arm. Xavier, wait, there's something you should know. The urgency in her voice stopped him. What? My name isn't Patterson, it's Price. Delilah Price, her amber eyes held his in the dim light filtering through the barn's high windows. My father was Robert Price. Xavier stared at her, understanding dawning with a cold clarity. The banker from Kansas City. The one who was murdered by Jim Farley and his gang last year, yes. Delilah's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. They came to our home. Father had refused to launder money for them. They killed him and my mother. I hid in a hope chest in the attic. When they left, I ran. Xavier's mind raced. Robert Price's murder had been notorious. A respected banker killed alongside his wife in their own home, allegedly for refusing to work with former guerrillas who had turned to outlawry. But there had been no mention of a daughter. The authorities believed I died in the fire they set, Delilah continued, as if reading his thoughts. I let them think that, took a new name, made my way to St. Louis, then arranged to go west, where no one would know me. But on the wagon train, I recognized one of them, Farley's brother, Lucas. He didn't see me, but you saw him, Xavier finished grimly, and now they know there's a witness. Delilah nodded, her fingers still gripping his arm. You understand now why I have to leave. They're not after a random witness, Xavier. They're after me specifically, the daughter of the man they murdered. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder. Any moment now, the night watch would spot them, or worse, they would reach the house undetected. We don't have time for this, Xavier said, making a swift decision. New plan, we both leave now. There's a hunting cabin in the foothills about 10 miles west. Reynolds uses it sometimes. They won't think to look there. But the ranch. Reynolds has 8 hands here. They can defend the place if needed. Xavier stood, pulling Delilah up with him. But you're the one Farley wants, and I'm not letting him find you. Come on. Moving quickly, Xavier saddled 2 horses, choosing the quietest mare in the stable for Delilah. As they worked, shouts erupted from the direction of the house. The night watch had spotted the intruders. Now, Xavier urged, helping Delilah mount before swinging into his own saddle. They slipped out the back of the barn and into the darkness, riding hard toward the western hills as gunshots echoed behind them. The hunting cabin was little more than a one-room structure tucked into a stand of pines halfway up a steep hillside. But it had a stone fireplace, a sturdy door with a good lock, and most importantly, it overlooked the trail leading up from the valley, giving them a clear view of anyone approaching. By the time they reached it, dawn was breaking. Xavier secured the horses in a small lean-to behind the cabin while Delilah collapsed on a rough-hewn chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The night's hard ride had left them both drained, but Xavier knew they couldn't rest yet. We need to prepare, he said, entering the cabin and immediately checking the supplies stored in a trunk against the wall. Food, water, ammunition. If Farley tracked you to Golden Plains, he might track us here. Delilah nodded wearily, pushing herself to her feet. Tell me what to do. Together they inventoried their resources. The cabin was reasonably well stocked. Reynolds kept it supplied for hunting trips. There was jerky, beans, coffee, ammunition for Xavier's revolver, and an old rifle hanging over the fireplace that still worked. As they worked, Xavier found himself studying Delilah with new eyes. The refined schoolteacher was still there in her precise movements and careful speech. But underneath was a survivor who had endured horrors he could scarcely imagine and still found the strength to keep going. Why Denver? He asked as they finished organizing the supplies. Why become a schoolteacher? Delilah paused, a tin of coffee in her hands. It was far from Kansas City, and I love children always have, teaching seemed. She shrugged. A way to build something good from so much destruction. The simplicity of her answer touched Xavier deeply. How different it was from his own response to loss, the years spent hardening himself, avoiding connections, viewing the frontier as merely a place to escape rather than to build. You're remarkable, Delilah Price, he said softly. Color touched her cheeks. I'm just trying to survive, same as anyone. No, Xavier shook his head. It's more than that. After what happened to your parents, most people would have broken. Or become bitter, vengeful. Like you did, she asked gently. Xavier stilled, her words landing like a physical blow. What do you mean? Delilah set down the coffee and moved closer to him. I recognize the look in your eyes, Xavier. It's the same one I saw in my mirror for months after they killed my parents. The look of someone who's walled themselves off from the world because it's too painful to remain open to it. Her insight was so accurate, so unexpectedly perceptive, that Xavier couldn't find words to respond. The difference, she continued, her amber eyes holding his, is that I realized that's no way to honor those we've lost. My parents would want me to live, not just survive. To love, not just exist. And have you, Xavier asked, his voice rough, loved, I mean? A small, sad smile touched her lips. Not yet, but I haven't stopped believing it's possible. Her hand reached up, hesitantly touching his cheek. Even out here on the frontier. Xavier's heart hammered in his chest as he looked down at this brave, beautiful woman who had suffered so much yet remained open to life's possibilities. In that moment, the walls he had built around his heart didn't just crack, they crumbled. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes, meeting his lips with hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. Delilah, I. The sound of a horse whinnying outside cut him off. Instantly alert, Xavier moved to the window, peering carefully through the grime-streaked glass. Riders, he said, his voice low, 3 of them coming up the trail. Fear flashed across Delilah's face. Farley. Xavier nodded grimly, recognizing the leader's distinctive red beard even at a distance. Him and 2 others. Must have split from the main group. He turned to Delilah, decision made. There's a root cellar under the floorboards by the fireplace. It's small, but you'll fit. No, Delilah said firmly. I'm not hiding while you face them alone. This isn't a debate, Xavier insisted, already moving to the loose floorboard. I've fought men like Farley before. I know what I'm doing. So do I, Delilah countered, picking up the rifle from over the fireplace. I've been running from them for a year. I'm done hiding, Xavier. The determination in her eyes told Xavier this was one argument he wouldn't win. And in truth, a part of him admired her courage, even as he feared for her safety. Stay by the window, then, he conceded. Keep the rifle ready, but don't show yourself unless you have no choice. She nodded, moving to position herself as Xavier checked his revolver one last time and stationed himself by the door. Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Xavier, Delilah said quietly, if this goes badly. He looked back at her, standing tall and resolute despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. It won't, he promised. But if it does, know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Emotion flickered across her face, but before she could respond, a voice called from outside. We know you're in there, Price. Come out now and maybe we'll let the cowboy live. Xavier met Delilah's eyes one last time, then squared his shoulders and opened the cabin door. Jim Farley sat astride a large black horse, flanked by 2 hard-faced men. All 3 had revolvers drawn. Xavier stepped onto the small porch, deliberately keeping his own weapon holstered. No one here by that name, he said calmly, just me. Farley's cold eyes assessed him. The outlaw was older than Xavier by a decade at least, his face weathered and scarred, his red beard shot through with gray. Don't play dumb, cowboy, we tracked you from the ranch. We know the Price girl is with you. You've got bad information, Xavier replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. Name's Xavier Jameson. I work for Thomas Reynolds at Golden Plains. This is his hunting cabin. And you just happened to ride out here in the middle of the night, Farley's voice dripped with skepticism, right when we came calling at the ranch. Xavier shrugged. Lucky timing, Reynolds sent me to check the northern pastures. Thought I'd spend the night here rather than ride back in the dark. He's lying, Jim, one of the other men said. Trail showed 2 horses. Farley's lips curled into an unpleasant smile. 2 horses, huh? He raised his voice. Miss Price, why don't you come on out now? We can settle this civilized like. No need for your friend here to get hurt. Inside the cabin, Delilah remained silent. Xavier prayed she would stay hidden. Last chance, cowboy, Farley warned, his revolver now pointed directly at Xavier's chest. Where is she? Xavier straightened, letting his hand drift toward his holster. Like I said, no one here but me. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Xavier saw Farley's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the other 2 outlaws raising their weapons. In that split second, he drew and fired in one fluid motion, diving to the side as bullets splintered the wood where he had been standing. His shot caught Farley in the shoulder, sending the outlaw reeling in his saddle. The other 2 men fired wildly as Xavier rolled behind a stack of firewood at the edge of the porch. From this position, he had limited cover but a clear shot at the mounted men. The crack of a rifle from inside the cabin took them all by surprise. One of Farley's men cried out, clutching his arm as his revolver fell to the ground. Delilah had joined the fight. "You little bitch," Farley snarled, firing toward the cabin window. "I should have made sure you died with your parents." Xavier used the distraction to take careful aim and fire again, catching the wounded outlaw in the chest. The man toppled from his horse, landing with a sickening thud on the hard ground. Farley and his remaining man pulled back, seeking cover behind a large boulder about 50 yards down the trail. Xavier knew they were temporarily at a stalemate. The outlaws couldn't approach without exposing themselves, but neither could he and Delilah leave the relative safety of the cabin. "Delilah," he called without taking his eyes off the boulder. "You all right?" "Yes," came her steady reply. "I can see them from here. The one I shot is trying to stop the bleeding in his arm." "Good shot," Xavier said, a hint of pride in his voice despite the dire situation. "My father taught me," she answered, her voice catching slightly. "He said a woman should know how to protect herself." "Smart man, your father." For several tense minutes no one moved. Then Farley's voice rang out from behind the boulder. "This doesn't end well for you, Jameson. We've got friends coming, lots of them. You think you can hold out against a dozen men?" It was likely a bluff. Farley's gang was known to be small, but Xavier couldn't be sure. And even if it was just the two of them, ammunition was limited and eventually they would need to sleep. "We need to end this now," he murmured, more to himself than to Delilah. "How?" she asked, having heard him anyway. Xavier quickly assessed their options. The horses were behind the cabin, potentially providing a means of escape, but they'd be exposed on the trail, easy targets for Farley and his man. Then he remembered something, a detail from his time scouting with Reynolds last hunting season. "There's a game trail that leads down the back side of this ridge," he said quietly. "It connects with the main trail about a mile below. If I can circle around behind them." "No," Delilah protested, "it's too dangerous, and you'd be leaving me alone." "Just for a few minutes, you keep them pinned down with the rifle." Xavier met her gaze. "I can end this, Delilah. Trust me." The fear in her eyes was clear, but so was her resolve. After a moment she nodded. "Be careful." Xavier slipped out the back window while Delilah fired several shots toward the boulder, forcing Farley and his man to keep their heads down. The game trail was steep and treacherous, but Xavier moved quickly, half sliding down the slope until he reached the point where it curved back toward the main trail. Moving silently through the underbrush, Xavier approached the boulder from behind. He could hear Farley and his man arguing in hushed voices. "Should just burn them out," the wounded man was saying. "And risk losing the only witness who can tie us to the Price killings," Farley snapped. "No, we need her dead and we need it clean." Xavier crept closer, revolver ready. Just as he prepared to make his move, a twig snapped under his boot. Farley whirled, firing blindly in Xavier's direction. The bullet grazed Xavier's arm, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline surging, he lunged forward, tackling Farley to the ground. They struggled fiercely, each fighting for control of their weapons. Farley was strong despite his wounded shoulder, his face contorted with rage as he smashed his fist into Xavier's jaw. Stars exploded in Xavier's vision, but he held on, bringing his revolver down hard on Farley's temple. The outlaw's grip loosened, and Xavier scrambled back, aiming his weapon at the dazed man. Too late, he remembered the second outlaw. Pain erupted in Xavier's side as a knife plunged between his ribs. Gasping, he turned and fired, the bullet catching the man in the chest at point-blank range. The outlaw crumpled, the knife still clutched in his hand. Farley was already recovering, reaching for his fallen revolver. Ignoring the burning pain in his side, Xavier kicked the weapon away and pressed his own revolver to Farley's head. "It's over," he said, his breath coming in pained gasps. "For Robert and Mary Price, for their daughter, for everyone you've hurt." Fear finally showed in Farley's cold eyes. "Wait, I can pay you. More money than you make in 10 years ranching." Xavier's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Delilah's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "My parents would want me to live, not just survive. To love, not just exist." Taking vengeance on Farley wouldn't undo the pain he had caused. It wouldn't bring back Delilah's parents or erase the scars of the past. All it would do was add another burden to Xavier's soul. "You're not worth it," Xavier said, lowering his weapon slightly. "You'll hang legally, that's justice enough." Using his belt, Xavier bound Farley's hands behind his back. then sat heavily on the ground, pressing his hand against the wound in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers and a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Xavier," Delilah's voice reached him from somewhere far away. He looked up to see her running down the trail, rifle in hand. Her face went pale when she saw the blood. "It's not as bad as it looks," he tried to assure her, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. Delilah knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. "You're a terrible liar, Xavier Jameson," she said, tears welling in her amber eyes. "Got him, though." Xavier managed a weak smile, nodding toward the bound Farley, who glared at them with impotent rage. "Yes, you did," Delilah agreed, her hands gentle as she tended his wound. "Now hold still and let me stop this bleeding before you do something else heroic." Despite the pain, Xavier felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The walls he had built around his heart had completely collapsed, letting in light he had denied himself for too long. "Delilah," he said softly. She looked up, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Yes. I think I'm falling in love with you." A smile broke through her tears. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you offered me your coat in that lined shack." Xavier reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek. "What happens now?" Delilah's eyes moved to Farley, then back to Xavier. "Now we go home, together. The rest we'll figure out along the way." Home, Xavier thought, not just a place but a feeling, a connection he had denied himself for too long. As Delilah helped him to his feet, supporting his weight against her slender frame, Xavier knew with absolute certainty that he had found something far more precious than the solitude he had once cherished. He had found his heart again. 3 months later, Xavier stood on the porch of a small but sturdy cabin on the eastern edge of Golden Plains Ranch. The summer sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a golden glow over the rolling grasslands stretching toward the distant mountains. His side had healed well, leaving only a scar to remind him of the encounter with Farley. The outlaw himself now resided in the territorial prison, sentenced to hang for the murders of Robert and Mary Price, along with numerous other crimes. With his testimony at the trial complete, Xavier had finally been able to focus on the future rather than the past. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Looking up, he saw Delilah riding toward the cabin, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, catching the last light of day. She rode with confidence now, at home on horseback as she was in the kitchen or the small schoolhouse that had been built on the ranch property at Reynolds' insistence. "You're late," Xavier called as she dismounted, tying her horse to the hitching post. "Was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." Delilah laughed, the sound like music to his ears. "About marrying you tomorrow." "Not a chance." She climbed the steps to the porch, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Martha insisted on one final fitting for the dress. That woman is determined that I'll be the most beautiful bride in Colorado territory." "You will be," Xavier assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Though you could wear those rags I found you in, and I'd still think so." Delilah's expression softened. Who would have thought that those rags would lead to this? A home, a teaching position, a husband. She reached up, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "You've given me everything I thought I'd lost forever, Xavier." "You've given me more," he replied, drawing her closer. "You made me remember what it means to really live." To love, he glanced at the small cabin they had built together, their first home as a married couple, to belong somewhere again. As the last light of day faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Xavier Jameson held the woman who had changed everything in his arms and felt truly at peace for the first time since the war. The frontier was still harsh, still dangerous in many ways, but it was also a place of new beginnings, of hope rising from the ashes of the past. "I love you, Delilah Jameson," he whispered, already savoring the name she would take tomorrow. She smiled up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight. "I love you too, Xavier, now and always." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Xavier knew that the false belief that had guided him for so long, that the frontier was no place for love, had been thoroughly disproven. Love didn't just survive on the frontier, it thrived there, stronger for the challenges it overcame, deeper for the hardships it endured. And in the years to come, as their family grew and their homestead flourished, the story of how Xavier found Delilah in rags would be told and retold. A reminder that sometimes in the most unexpected places and the most desperate circumstances, a heart can find its way home.